The sun smiled warmly over Ibadan that Saturday morning, the kind of golden light that makes the air feel thick with promise and whispers of destiny. It was the sort of day that people would remember for years, not because of what they wore or what they ate, but because something in the air made everything feel magical. At the very heart of the city, towering like a silent witness to generations of stories, Christ the Redeemer Church stood proud and pure, its brilliant white walls shimmering against the backdrop of a cloudless sky. But this was no ordinary church. No, this was the sacred ground where the rich, the powerful, and the famous came to anchor their legacies. The city's elite lined up to marry here, to baptize their children, to say their final goodbyes. If you mattered in Ibadan, this was where your most significant life moments unfolded. And on that day, all eyes turned to this place for what was promised to be the wedding of the year. Long before the first guest arrived, the air around the church was already thick with activity. Gardeners trimmed every hedge until it looked like emerald lace. White ribbons danced on the gates like ballerinas in the breeze. Expensive vehicles polished until they reflected the heavens rolled in one by one. Men in sharply tailored uniforms opened doors with mechanical precision, and women in luxurious fabrics stepped out like queens returning to their thrones. Inside the church, golden chandeliers sparkled like constellations, hanging from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the heavens. Velvet-lined pews shimmered under the soft glow of daylight that streamed in through vast stained glass windows. The air smelled of roses and imported jasmine. Everything was perfect, too perfect. Standing silently at the front, dressed in a robe of purest white, embroidered with golden threads, was Pastor Samuel Adami. He was a man shaped by time and wisdom, a little round in the middle, with hair that had faded into salt and pepper, but eyes that still held the warmth of youth and the watchfulness of a lion. For 25 years, he had blessed unions, buried dreams, and welcomed new lives into the world. But on this day, as he stood by the altar, a strange weight sat on his chest. It wasn't visible, it wasn't loud, but it was there. A whisper of unease curled inside him like smoke in a sealed jar. He knew better than to ignore it, for even in the house of joy, shadows sometimes slipped through the doors. The bride, Kemi Adami, was the embodiment of grace. Born into one of the wealthiest families in the city, she was a paradox of privilege and humility. Her father, Chief Adami, had built an empire of hotels and real estate, but he and his wife had raised Kemi with simplicity, teaching her that kindness was greater than gold. She had grown up loved, admired, protected. But despite her beauty, despite the line of suitors who courted her for her name and fortune, her heart remained untouched. That is until Faye Adebayo returned. Everyone in the church today knew this story, or thought they did. Childhood sweethearts separated by distance, reunited by fate. It was the kind of tale you'd find in a best-selling romance novel, the kind people whispered about in hair salons and coffee shops. Kemi and Femi had once been inseparable, playing barefoot in dusty courtyards, sharing sugarcane and secrets. But when Faye's family moved abroad, the friendship dissolved like a chalk drawing in the rain. There had been no letters, no phone calls, just silence, until one rainy night many years later, when Kemi opened her phone to find a message from a name she thought she'd never see again. Faye Adebayo. The conversation had started slow, cautious, curious. Then, like fire catching dry grass, it had spread. They exchanged old memories, filled in the gaps, laughed at how little they had changed. He told her stories of his life in London, of strict parents, of loneliness, of his search for her through the years. He apologized for the silence. She forgave him too quickly maybe, but her heart wanted to believe. They met soon after in a cozy cafe, tucked in a quiet corner of the city. He arrived with that same boyish charm now worn on a man's frame. Tall, confident, his voice smooth like silk, dipped in honey. Kemi had smiled so hard her cheeks hurt, and just like that, the past rewrote itself in the language of second chances. Their love bloomed like spring after a long drought. Every dinner, every walk, every whisper made her believe that maybe, just maybe, fairy tales were real. Within months, he proposed. Down on one knee with shaking hands and tears in his eyes, he asked her to be his forever. And Kemi, blinded by love and hope, said yes. Her parents, though initially hesitant, could not deny the light she radiated whenever Faye was near. They gave their blessing and the wheels of wedding planning turned at dizzying speed. Now, as Pastor Samuel watched Faye standing at the altar, he studied the young man's face. Handsome, no doubt, charismatic. But something didn't sit right. Faye's smile was perfect, too perfect. His hands moved constantly, adjusting his tie, brushing invisible dust from his jacket, tapping his fingers on his thigh. Pastor Samuel had seen nervous grooms, but this was not nerves. This was something deeper, a man hiding something. A performance. He said nothing, but he prayed quietly. Lord, if there is deception today, reveal it before the vows are made. The choir began to hum. Guests leaned forward in anticipation. The church was full of whispered excitement, flashes of cameras, soft murmurs about her gown, his smile, their story. Flower girls giggled as they walked down the aisle, scattering petals like blessings from heaven. The doors opened. A hush fell. There she was. Kemi Adami glided into the church like a vision out of a dream. Her gown was pure magic white silk and tiny crystals that caught the light and set her glowing like a star fallen to earth. Her veil was long, her posture regal. The guests rose as one. The music swelled. She walked slowly, arm in arm with her father, her eyes fixed on the man she believed to be her future. The groom smiled wider, too wide. He shifted like a man standing on cracked ice. Pastor Samuel whispered once more, Father, if this union is built on falsehood, break it before it binds. Their hands met, fingers intertwined. The crowd sighed, and yet in that soft moment a chill passed through the old pastor's bones. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, but his spirit would not rest. The ceremony began, but his eyes never left the groom. He watched every blink, every word, every tremble, and the weight in his chest grew heavier. What the guests didn't know, what even Kemi didn't know, was that this story hadn't truly begun at the altar. It had started 2 weeks earlier in a quiet room during premarital counseling. Pastor Samuel had sat with them, smiling warmly, asking questions. Kemi had answered with joy. Faye had been careful, too careful, when asked what local festival they had celebrated as kids. He said, the Yam Festival in April. But the Yam Festival in Ibadan was in August, a tiny detail easily missed, but not by Pastor Samuel. Another time, someone mentioned Mama Titi, a woman known for her Akara Faye, laughed and called her the plantain seller. Another small error, another hairline crack when asked about his family. Faye always looked away, sighed deeply, and muttered something about tragedy and loss. But the pain didn't feel real. It felt rehearsed, avoidant. And then during the final rehearsal, he had casually asked, Pastor, can we skip the speak now or forever hold your peace part? A harmless request, maybe. But in Pastor Samuel's experience, only men hiding something feared that moment of truth. He prayed harder that night than he had in years. And the next day, an old man appeared at the church's back door. A man in a brown agbada, walking with the wisdom of years. He called himself Baba Adabayo, Femi's uncle. Or rather not. I saw the wedding invitation, the old man had said. That man, he looks like Femi, but he is not him. Blood in Pastor Samuel's veins ran cold. The revelation from Baba Adabayo echoed in Pastor Samuel's mind long after the old man left his office. It wasn't the kind of claim that could be ignored or brushed aside. It wasn't just a warning from a distant relative. It was a crack of thunder before a storm. And in Pastor Samuel's heart, That storm had already begun to gather. He sat alone in the silence of his study that evening, his hands resting on the leather-bound Bible he had carried for decades, his eyes fixed on the fading light outside. He prayed again, not for a perfect wedding, but for a truthful one. And as night fell over Ibadan, he made a decision, one that could either save a life or shatter it. The next day, under the soft golden light of early evening, Pastor Samuel met with Kemi, and the man calling himself Femi, one final time before the wedding. He smiled as always, but his questions came like threads, soft and slow, designed not to attack but to unravel. "Tell me again," he said gently, "how you both reconnected after all these years." Kemi's face lit up with affection. "He found me online, Pastor," she said. "A mutual friend posted a school picture and he reached out, said he never stopped looking for me." Pastor Samuel nodded, his eyes turning to Femi. "And you, my son, tell me, what was your favorite place to play in Ibadan as children?" Femi chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ah, Pastor, you know it's been so long. Memory plays tricks, but I think it was that fountain in Bodija. We always went there to splash water and chase each other." Kemi laughed softly beside him and nodding, but Pastor Samuel did not. His heart sank. There had never been a fountain in Bodija. Not then, not now. Only markets and quiet homes. The pastor smiled politely and changed the subject, but inside his spirit screamed. That night he called Chief Adami. The two men sat beneath the stars in the chief's garden, drinking tea in silence before Pastor Samuel spoke. "Sir, I do not come to bring panic," he began, "but I come with truth. I do not trust the man your daughter is about to marry." Chief Adami listened without interrupting. When the pastor finished, the chief said nothing for a long while. Then he nodded. "We shall not cancel the wedding, but we will be ready for whatever comes." And so it was that quiet security was put in place, not to guard wealth or pride, but to protect truth. The wedding morning arrived like a dream. Every seat in the church was filled, every eye bright with curiosity and joy. The governor's car rolled in. Traditional rulers arrived in shimmering agbadas, and celebrities flashed their smiles like lightning before a storm. The choir rehearsed one last time, and the air smelled of rosewater and possibility. Kemi was a vision of hope. Her joy was pure, her trust unwavering. She didn't see the doubts in Faye's eyes. She didn't hear the nervous tremble in his laughter. She didn't notice how he scanned the crowd again and again like a man waiting for something or someone to interrupt his lie. Pastor Samuel stood at the altar, every word of the ceremony prepared in his heart, but his eyes never left the groom. His spirit stayed sharp like a blade waiting for the moment to strike. The prayers began, the hymns followed. Guests sighed, whispered, and wiped away happy tears, and then the time came. The moment the groom had once tried to erase. Pastor Samuel lifted his Bible. "If anyone here knows a reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," he said clearly, his voice ringing through the church like a bell, "let them speak now or forever. Hold their peace, silence." A second passed, then two, then three. People smiled, shifting in their seats. The moment was almost past, until a chair scraped loudly against the floor. All heads turned. It was Baba Adebayo. His voice shook, but it was strong. "That man is not my nephew," he declared, pointing a trembling finger at the groom. Gasps erupted. Kemi froze, her mouth open in shock. Femi's hands tightened around hers, not with love, but with panic. Pastor Samuel stepped forward slowly. "Brother Femi," he said, calm but firm, "you have heard the accusation. For the peace of this sacred gathering, please speak." Femi forced a laugh, but it cracked. "Pastor, I don't know what this old man is talking about. Maybe he's mistaken. It's been years. People change. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pastor Samuel raised a hand for silence. Your uncle claims the real Femi had a birthmark, he said. A star-shaped one behind your right ear. Please, my son, show us. Femi's face turned to stone. He laughed again, but it was hollow. I had it removed, he said quickly. A surgery. I hated how it looked. More murmurs. Someone whispered, who removes a birthmark behind the ear? Another voice called out, there should be a scar. Pastor Samuel stepped closer. Then show us. If there's no birthmark, show the scar. Let us all have peace. Femi's hand trembled as it reached for his ear. He hesitated, and then slowly he turned his head. Silence fell like a shroud. There was nothing there. No mark, no scar. Just smooth, untouched skin. The air grew heavy. Pastor Samuel's voice stayed gentle. My son, now you see why questions arise. Speak truthfully. God is still merciful. Femi's shoulders sagged. His strength drained away. I am not Femi, he said at last. My real name is Chinedu Nosu. The confession shattered the room. Cries, gasps. A woman sobbed. Another fainted. Kemi's lips quivered. She tried to speak, but no words came. Pastor Samuel remained still. Tell us everything, he said, and Chinedu did. He told them how he had met the real Femi at university abroad, how Femi was rich, kind and broken after losing his parents, how they had become like brothers, how Femi had spoken often of a girl named Kemi, how he had died in a terrible accident, how Chinedu, left with nothing, no money, no family, no home, had made a choice. I found his old messages, his pictures. Chinedu said, I studied them, I became him. I reached out to Kemi. I used everything I knew to win her heart. Some wept, others turned away. Pastor Samuel's face did not change. Why? He asked quietly. Chinedu looked around, broken. Money, he said. Power, a way out of the life I hated. I thought if I married her, I would inherit everything. No more hunger, no more shame. He dropped to his knees. I'm sorry, he said, sobbing. I never meant to hurt anyone, but the damage had been done. The fairy tale was over. The truth had crushed it. Then without warning, Chinedu bolted down the aisle, but the two security men moved fast. They caught him just before the doors. He struggled, but it was over. As he was led out, the church sat in stunned silence. Kemi's father whispered a thank you to Pastor Samuel, who only nodded. The rest of the day passed in a haze of sorrow. Guests left quietly. Some cried, some hugged Kemi. No one blamed her. They blamed him, the man who had turned love into a weapon. In the days that followed, the city exploded with news. Headlines screamed, fake groom exposed at the altar. Kemi Adami's wedding tragedy. Trust and deceit in the age of love. But Kemi did not run. She did not hide. She stayed. She grieved. She allowed herself to feel everything, to break, to cry, to scream. And then she began to rise. 1 month later, she launched the Light Foundation, a movement dedicated to empowering women and educating the public on fraud, emotional manipulation, and identity deception. Her first public appearance brought the city to its feet. I ignored the signs, she said, because I wanted to believe in love. But now I know love must never come at the cost of truth. The applause was thunderous. At the back of the hall, Pastor Samuel smiled proud. His heart was full, not with triumph, but with peace. The truth had prevailed. Kemi was healing, and life, ever faithful, was beginning to bloom again. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable day at Christ the Redeemer Church, and Ibadan had slowly returned to its rhythm-bustling streets, noisy markets, golden sunsets that melted over rooftops. But within the heart of the city, something had quietly shifted. The church, that once symbolized grand unions and lavish ceremonies, now carried a deeper reputation, not for spectacle, but for standing guard at the gate between truth and illusion. And at its center, Pastor Samuel Adami had become more than just a man of the cloth. To many, he was now a guardian of truth, a quiet warrior who had dared to question what everyone else accepted, a shepherd who saved a lamb just before it was led to the slaughter. His sermons every Sunday were no longer just gentle teachings. They were filled with a deeper fire, his voice seasoned with pain, patience, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from witnessing love crumble under the weight of lies. Every pew was filled now, not just with the elite, but with ordinary people drawn by the story, by the mystery, and by the undeniable truth that one man's discernment had changed a life, and maybe even saved one. Kemi Adami had become a different kind of name since the scandal. Her story was no longer just whispered in gossip salons or printed in tabloid headlines. It had transformed into something else, something people respected. She had not escaped to London or gone into hiding under a new name. She had stayed. She had shown up at her family's business meetings, walked into community events, attended weddings and birthdays with her head held high. And though her heart was battered and her smile sometimes faded too quickly, she refused to become a victim. In those first weeks, she cried often. The tears would come without warning, when folding her laundry, when smelling the perfume she wore on what would have been her wedding day, when seeing couples hold hands in public. But she allowed herself that pain. She did not push it away. She let the heartbreak run its course like a fever breaking the body. And when it passed, she stood again, not untouched, but stronger. The light foundation became her new heartbeat. A non-profit built from the ashes of her public heartbreak, it quickly rose to national attention. The mission was simple: educate, empower, and protect. Kemi gave talks in schools, held workshops for young women, organized seminars where real stories of deception were shared, dissected, and learned from. She told her story again and again, not with shame, but with purpose. Love must be honest, she would say, and we must love ourselves enough to ask the hard questions, even when the answers may hurt. Young women admired her. Parents thanked her. Survivors of emotional fraud wrote letters saying her voice had helped them walk away from their own dark stories. Kemi had turned pain into purpose, and that purpose lit her path forward like lanterns in the night. And yet, somewhere deep in the corners of her heart, there lingered one unanswered question. Would she ever love again? Could her heart, once wrapped around a fantasy, ever truly trust a reality? She wasn't looking for love. That door for now remained closed, but the ache was there. Quiet, patient, ever present. She had tasted what she thought was love, and it had betrayed her. How would she recognize the real thing if it ever came? Then came a day that felt at first like any other. The sun was modest that afternoon, hidden behind a thin veil of clouds. Kemi had risen early to deliver educational supplies to a children's ward in one of the local hospitals, dressed in a simple white blouse and blue jeans, her hair tied back in a low bun. She looked nothing like the glamorous heiress the newspapers once featured. There was no makeup, no jewelry, just Kemi as she was. She moved quietly through the corridors, carrying boxes of storybooks and drawing sets, her heart content in the small joy of giving. She was placing the last box onto a table when one of the stacks slipped. A dozen books crashed to the floor, pages fluttering like startled butterflies. "Let me help you with that," a calm voice said from behind her. She turned. A young man in a faded hospital volunteer uniform was already crouched gathering the books. His hands were rough from labor, his shirt slightly wrinkled, but his smile was soft, patient and warm. "Thank you," she said, catching her breath. He looked up, meeting her eyes without the usual flicker of recognition, no widened stare, no awkward shift that meant he knew her story, just quiet kindness. "I'm Daniel," he said, lifting the final book. "I work here part-time. And you are?" For a brief second she hesitated, then she smiled. "Kemi." No last name, no titles, just Kemi. They talked briefly about the hospital's needs, about the children in the ward, about how books could heal in ways medicine couldn't. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and never once tried to impress. There were no compliments about her looks, no prying questions about her past, no attempts to sound more important than he was. When their conversation ended, Daniel simply said, "It was nice meeting you. I hope our paths cross again," and walked away, returning to his duties. That night, for the first time in many weeks, Kemi found herself smiling without force. There was no whirlwind, no dizzying charm, no butterflies, but there was peace, and peace, she was learning, was better. Over the next few weeks, their paths did cross again. She returned to the hospital for another event and found him painting murals with the children. He returned to the foundation to drop off donations collected by volunteers. Slowly, gently, a friendship began to grow. They talked about ordinary things, books, dreams, life goals. Daniel never pressed, never pushed. He didn't flinch. When she finally told him the truth about her past, he listened. Then he said, "That wasn't your fault, Kemi. What matters is how you carried yourself afterward. That says more about you than any man ever could." Their connection deepened, not with fireworks, but with warmth. He would walk her to her car without asking for her number. She would bring him food from events he couldn't attend. One day, after they helped repaint a children's classroom, he handed her a brush and said with a grin, "If we ever open a school together, you're in charge of the art department." She laughed, really laughed. And something in her heart, something that had long been quiet, stirred one Sunday as she sat in the front row of Christ the Redeemer Church. Pastor Samuel looked out over the congregation and began his sermon. His voice was strong, his tone tender. "Discernment," he said, "is a gift from God, but we must not confuse fear with wisdom. Love is not the enemy, deception is. When truth walks with love, nothing can stand against it." And as Kemi sat listening, her hand gently resting on Daniel's beside her, she felt a quiet affirmation in her soul. She hadn't run from love. She had waited for the real thing, and now here it was. No disguise, no performance, no fantasy, just a man who showed up not to sweep her off her feet, but to walk beside her at her own pace. Months passed, seasons changed. The city forgot the scandal, but it remembered the strength. Kemi's foundation grew. Daniel eventually became a full-time coordinator. They worked side by side, hand in hand, not just building an organization, but building something sacred between them. When Daniel finally proposed, quietly under the shade of a tree at the hospital where they'd first met, Kemi didn't cry. She smiled, reached into her bag and pulled out an old, faded wooden bracelet. "I used to think this was the symbol of my first love," she said. "But maybe it was just the reminder that real love takes time and truth." Their wedding was nothing like the first attempt. No television crews, no VIP guests, just close family, trusted friends, and the sound of genuine laughter in the air. Pastor Samuel officiated, his voice steady with emotion. "This," he said, looking at them both, "is the marriage I prayed for, built not on illusion, but on honesty, not on fear, but on faith." Kemi's vows were simple. "I don't promise you perfection," she said, "but I promise you truth. I promise you peace. I promise you all of me as I am." And then Daniel, his eyes glistening, whispered, "That's all I've ever wanted." As they kissed and the guests clapped, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light onto the church floor like a quiet, blessing from heaven later that evening, as Kemi stood alone for a moment watching the sunset from the small garden beside the reception hall, Pastor Samuel joined her. "You walked through fire," he said, his eyes kind, "and you came out gold." Kemi turned to him, her eyes glowing. "No, Pastor, I came out whole." And as the music played, as laughter filled the garden, and as the stars began to blink awake above, Ibadan, Kemi knew one thing with absolute certainty: fairy tales may lie, but real love, honest, quiet and true, writes the most beautiful stories of all. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of Kemi's powerful journey. This wasn't just a story about heartbreak and deception. It was a story about resilience, healing, and the quiet strength it takes to rise again. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on love and truth, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to leave a comment below and share how the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more unforgettable stories. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, real love always tells the truth.